Washington, A Life by Ron Chernow. Podcast script. Host, The Wise Storyteller. Imagine a young man, barely 23, standing on a riverbank deep in the American wilderness. Smoke hangs heavy in the air, mixing with the sharp crack of musket fire. Around him, British soldiers, the finest fighting force the world has ever known, are breaking apart like a shattered mirror. They're throwing down their weapons and running blind with terror, like sheep scattered by wolves, as he'd later describe it. 2 horses have already been shot from beneath him. 4 bullet holes pierce his coat, yet somehow, impossibly, he stands untouched, an island of eerie calm in an ocean of chaos. He's not some battle-hardened general. He's a provincial colonel, an outsider, a young man practically vibrating with barely concealed ambition. He'd warned his commander, General Braddock, that fighting in the frontier wasn't like fighting on European battlefields, but the general had brushed him aside. Now Braddock is dying, and the weight of this catastrophic defeat, one that will send shockwaves across 2 continents, is landing squarely on this young Virginian's shoulders. His name? George Washington. What shapes a man like that? How does someone who felt ashamed of his defective education become the most respected figure of his age? How does a person who battled a volcanic temper his entire life transform himself into the very picture of self-control? And how does this seemingly distant, almost cold figure inspire a ragtag army and a newborn nation to achieve what everyone said was impossible? Welcome to the Billionaire's Bookshelf. I'm your guide, and today we're cracking open a book that answers these questions with stunning insight. Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize-winning masterpiece, Washington, A Life. Ron Chernow isn't just a historian. He's more like a detective of the human soul. He actually started out studying English literature, learning how to tell a compelling story, before he ever dove into dusty archives. From banking empires in the House of Morgan to the oil titan John D. Rockefeller, Chernow has made a career of getting inside the heads of famously private people, understanding the inner worlds of those who changed ours. His biography of Alexander Hamilton inspired that little Broadway show you might have heard of. But it was while writing about Hamilton that something clicked for Chernow. To really understand how America was born, he needed to understand the man standing at the absolute center of it all. This book is what came from that realization. It's not just history, it's an intimate expedition into the mind and heart of George Washington. And I promise you, by the time we're done here, you won't see him as some marble statue or the boring guy on your money. You'll see a real, breathing, deeply human leader who stumbled, failed, and ultimately succeeded against staggering odds. You'll discover the secret to his leadership. And spoiler alert, it's not about being perfect. It's about a lifelong, almost obsessive dedication to becoming better. And you'll understand why his story isn't just about America's beginning, but a timeless masterclass in how character gets forged and how one life, lived with real purpose, can literally change the world. Here's something most people don't realize. If you want to truly understand a great person, don't start with their victories. Start with their struggles. For George Washington, the biggest, most exhausting struggle was with himself. People who only saw him in command thought he was made of stone. But those who really knew him, like the painter Gilbert Stuart, saw something completely different. Stuart once said that if Washington had been born in the deep woods, he would have been the fiercest person alive. He saw in Washington's face the unmistakable marks of the strongest and most ungovernable passions. And he was absolutely right. Thomas Jefferson said that when Washington's temper finally broke free, he was most tremendous in wrath. This was the great paradox of the man. A deeply emotional, passionate soul, trapped inside a body he'd trained, with iron-willed discipline, to be an unmoving tower of composure. His life story is really the story of that internal war. It started in a world that feels impossibly far away now, in the Tidewater region of Virginia, a landscape of endless tobacco fields and rigid social ladders. His family, the Washingtons, were respectable but not exactly at the top. Think of them as solid middle-tier gentry, enough land and enslaved people to be comfortable, but always looking up at the great families like the Fairfaxes and Carters with a complicated mix of envy and hunger. This position gave young George a restless, driving energy, an almost desperate desire to prove himself, to climb higher. His world collapsed when he was just 11. His father, Augustine, a tough, powerful man, died suddenly after riding out in a storm. This loss threw a long, dark shadow over everything that followed. It robbed George of the chance at a proper European education, the kind his older half-brothers Lawrence and Augustine Jr. had gotten. This defective education, as he'd call it, became a wound he'd carry his entire life, a source of constant insecurity. It also threw him into the daily orbit of his mother, Mary Ball Washington, who was, well, she was a force. Mary was tough, rigid, and deeply anxious. She almost never praised George, and seemed oddly resentful of his ambitions, as if his desire to make something of himself was somehow a betrayal of her. When 14-year-old George got a chance to join the Royal Navy, an absolute dream for any ambitious colonial kid, his mother first said yes, then snatched the opportunity away at the last second, killing it dead. It was the first of many times she'd try to hold him back, measuring his worth not by what he could become, but by what he could do for her. Dealing with this difficult woman taught George a brutal lesson in self-control. He learned to master his temper, to bite his tongue, to retreat into polite, formal silence. He became the master of his own emotions because he was terrified of what might happen if he ever lost control. This struggle was the furnace where his famous stoic demeanor was forged. With his path to formal education blocked, George turned to action and found a mentor in his dashing older half-brother Lawrence. Lawrence had served as a captain in the British military and came home with thrilling war stories. He married into the Fairfax family, the most powerful clan in Virginia, and through this connection, young George got introduced to a world of stunning wealth and influence at their magnificent estate, Belvoir. This is where his life's great ambition crystallized. He didn't want to just be a farmer, he wanted to be a gentleman, a man of real standing, a soldier. He studied the manners of his social superiors like a scientist, meticulously copying down 110 rules of civility and decent behavior, to polish away his rough country edges. He learned to dance, to ride with breathtaking grace, and to carry himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. His first real adventure came at 16, when he joined a surveying expedition into the wilds of the Shenandoah Valley. This was a universe away from the refined drawing rooms of Belvoir. He slept in smoky tents, crossed raging rivers, and learned to endure hardship with a quiet toughness that would define him. But more than that, this journey west lit a fire in him, a lifelong fascination with the vast, untamed continent. He began seeing America not as a narrow strip of coastal colonies, but as a future empire. This ambition soon found its outlet in the military. In 1753, at just 21, Virginia's Governor Robert Dinwiddie handed him a dangerous mission: travel deep into Ohio country and deliver an ultimatum to the French to abandon their forts on what the British claimed was their land. It was a journey that nearly ended him. A hostile guide shot at him. He capsized into an icy river, He hiked through a blizzard that should have killed him. But he came back not just with a defiant French reply, but with a detailed journal that got published in both the colonies and London, giving this unknown young Virginian his first taste of international fame. The world was now careening toward collision, and Washington was standing right at the impact point. The following year, he was sent back to the Ohio frontier, this time leading a small force of Virginia troops. In a hidden glen in May 1754, his life and world history took a dramatic turn. Convinced a small French party was spying on him, Washington and his Indian allies launched a surprise attack. The fight was over in 15 minutes, but among the dead was a French ensign named Jumonville, who happened to be carrying a diplomatic message. The French screamed assassination. The English called it a victory. Sir Horace Walpole in London would later say that this volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire. It was the opening shot of the 7 Years' War, a conflict that would engulf the globe. Washington, now a colonel, quickly threw up a crude fort he named Fort Necessity. He was soon surrounded by a much larger French force, and on a day of pouring rain, with his men's gunpowder soaked and worthless, he was forced to surrender. In the surrender document, written in French and badly translated, Washington accidentally signed a confession admitting to Jumonville's, quote, assassination. He came home to Virginia a hero to some, a reckless fool to others, but he'd learned a harsh lesson about frontier warfare and the sting of public scandal. His greatest military education, though, came the next year, when he volunteered as an aide to British General Edward Braddock on a massive expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. Braddock was every inch a classic European general, brave, arrogant, and completely dismissive of the colonists and their unconventional fighting style. Washington tried warning him about Indian ambush tactics, but Braddock scoffed. These savages may frighten your raw American militia, but they could never make an impression on the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir. On the banks of the Monongahela River, Braddock's army walked straight into exactly the trap Washington had feared. Hidden in the trees, French and Indian forces unleashed devastating fire. The British regulars, trained to fight in open European fields, fell into complete chaos. They fired wildly, sometimes hitting their own men, then broke and ran. Washington, though seriously weakened by a terrible case of dysentery, rode everywhere across that hellish battlefield, delivering orders, rallying retreating troops, showing an almost supernatural courage under fire. He emerged from that massacre as one of its few heroes, his reputation for bravery now legendary. But he also took away something crucial. The invincible British army could be beaten. It was a lesson that would one day reshape history. After Braddock's disaster, Washington was made commander of all Virginia's forces, given the impossible job of defending a 350-mile frontier against brutal raids. For 5 years, he dealt with the grinding realities of military command: undisciplined recruits, terrible supplies, meddling politicians. He clashed constantly with British authorities over the inferior rank and pay colonial officers received, insults that fed a slow-burning resentment inside him. More than anything, he craved a royal commission in the British Army, a symbol of acceptance and respectability, but it was always just out of reach. The British Empire simply had no room for a man of his talent and ambition. During these long, frustrating frontier years, Washington learned to be more than just a soldier. He became a leader. He figured out how to impose discipline, how to manage different kinds of men, and how to navigate the treacherous currents of politics. The rash young officer from Fort Necessity became a more patient, more strategic commander. But the military wasn't his only focus. In 1759, he married a wealthy and charming widow named Martha Dandridge Custis. The marriage was a turning point. It didn't just bring him massive wealth. Martha's fortune instantly made him one of the richest men in Virginia. It gave him the stability and emotional foundation he'd always craved. Martha was warm, sociable, and utterly devoted to him, the perfect partner for a man who'd never known unconditional love from his own mother. Martha came with 2 young children, Jackie and Patsy, and Washington, who would never have biological children, threw himself into being a devoted, if sometimes strict, stepfather. With marriage, Washington entered a new chapter, the gentleman planter. He settled at Mount Vernon, the estate he'd inherited from Lawrence, and dedicated himself to turning it into a model of scientific agriculture and refined living. He experimented with crop rotation, designed his own buildings, and managed his vast holdings with obsessive attention to detail. He was building his own world, a small kingdom on the Potomac's banks. But this kingdom stood on a foundation that would trouble him for the rest of his days: slavery. Like every other Virginia planter, Washington owned enslaved people. In his early years, he bought and sold human beings like any other commodity. But the ideals of the Revolution, ideals he'd come to embody, began awakening something in him, a deep and growing unease. He started seeing the stunning hypocrisy of fighting for liberty while holding others in chains. He'd eventually tell a friend he wished from his soul that Virginia's legislature would pursue gradual abolition. This moral conflict would become one of the great unresolved tensions of his life. As he settled into country squire life, the world outside was shifting. By the mid-1760s, Britain, staggering under massive debt from the 7 Years' War, began imposing a series of taxes on the colonies: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. To Washington and many other colonists, this wasn't just about money. It was a fundamental violation of their rights as Englishmen. "The Parliament of Great Britain," he wrote with rising fury, "has no more right to put their hands into my pocket without my consent than I have to put my hands in yours for money." The quiet planter was becoming a political militant. In 1769, he introduced a plan in Virginia's legislature to boycott British goods. While he still hoped for peace, he was crystal clear about the alternative. Arms should be the last resort, he told his friend George Mason, but he had zero doubt they should be used if necessary to defend American liberty. The final break came in 1775, after the battles at Lexington and Concord. When the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia to decide the colonies' fate, Washington showed up in a striking blue and buff military uniform. He didn't say much, but his outfit spoke volumes. He was ready for war. There were other, more experienced military men available, but the colonies needed more than just a general. They needed a symbol of unity. They needed someone who could command respect from all 13 colonies. And in that room, only one man fit that description. As John Adams would say, Washington's appointment was a political necessity. On June 15, 1775, the man who'd been denied a British commission was named Commander-in-Chief of the new Continental Army. He accepted with genuine humility that wasn't an act. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he told Congress. He knew the odds were impossible. He was leading a ragtag collection of farmers and shopkeepers against the most powerful military machine on earth. For the next 8.5 years, he'd live on disaster's edge. He faced crushing defeat in New York, a series of humiliating retreats across New Jersey, and the brutal winter at Valley Forge, where his army was ravaged by starvation, disease, and despair. Through it all, he was the one constant, the indispensable man. He held the army together not with brilliant victories, He actually lost more battles than he won, but with the sheer force of his character. His men, who'd once seemed to him a dirty and nasty people, became his family. He shared their hardships, felt their suffering, and earned their absolute loyalty. There were moments of breathtaking daring, like the surprise crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night 1776 to attack the Hessians at Trenton. It was a desperate gamble that paid off, a victory that revived the Revolution's dying embers. But mostly, it was a long, grinding war of attrition. Washington's strategy wasn't to win spectacular victories, but to not lose. To keep the army in the field, wear down the British, and wait for a miracle. That miracle arrived as the French alliance. The victory at Saratoga convinced France that the American cause wasn't hopeless, and they entered the war on the colonists' side. The final act came in 1781 at a small tobacco port called Yorktown. Washington, in brilliant coordination with French forces, trapped the main British army under Lord Cornwallis. With the French fleet blocking the sea and Allied armies besieging from land, Cornwallis was forced to surrender. The world turned upside down. Even in this moment of ultimate triumph, Washington was the picture of quiet dignity. He'd achieved the impossible. But looking ahead, he saw not the struggle's end, but the beginning of a new one, the struggle to create an actual nation. The post-war years were chaotic. The new country, governed by the weak Articles of Confederation, was falling apart. States bickered, the economy collapsed, and many feared the revolution had been for nothing. Washington, who'd longed for a quiet farmer's life, watched from Mount Vernon with growing alarm. "Something must be done," he warned, "or the fabric must fall, for it is certainly tottering." He was called from retirement again, this time as president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He sat in the president's chair, a silent, presiding presence, lending his massive prestige to creating a new, stronger government. The delegates, in many ways, designed the presidency with him specifically in mind, entrusting the office with great power because they knew he'd be the first to hold it. When the Constitution was ratified, there was zero question who'd be the first president. Washington accepted with the same reluctance he'd shown in 1775, feeling, as he told a friend, like, quote, a culprit going to the place of his execution. For the next 8 years, he'd face a challenge even greater than war, turning the Constitution's words into a living, functioning government. As president, he was no longer just a general, he was a statesman. He created the first cabinet, with the brilliant and often clashing titans, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. He established the nation's financial system, asserted American neutrality in European wars, and put down a rebellion in western Pennsylvania, proving the new government could enforce its laws. Through everything, he was guided by one unwavering principle: preserving the Union. But the presidency took a brutal toll. He was viciously attacked in the press, accused of being a secret king, and betrayed by old friends turned political enemies. He'd grown old in his country's service, and he desperately longed for Mount Vernon's peace. In 1796, he made what was perhaps his most important contribution to the new republic. He voluntarily stepped down from power. In his farewell address, a timeless statement of political wisdom, he warned his countrymen against the dangers of political factions and foreign entanglements. He'd taught the young country a final, crucial lesson. In a republic, power isn't held forever. It's passed on. He returned to Mount Vernon, a living legend, the American Cincinnatus. He spent his final years, as he'd always wished, as a farmer, surrounded by family, but his mind kept working. In his final will, he made a decision he'd been wrestling with for years. He ordered that all his enslaved people be freed upon his wife's death. It was his last, quiet act in service of the liberty he'd fought for his entire life. In December 1799, after riding his horse in cold rain and snow, he fell ill with a severe throat infection. He faced his final battle with the same calm courage he'd shown all his life. "I die hard," he told his doctors, "but I am not afraid to go." He was 67 years old. The man who'd been at the center of a revolution, a war, and the creation of a new government had finally come home to rest. So what do we take from a life like that? A life so enormous, so central to a nation's story, that it's almost impossible to see the actual man inside the monument? I think the first thing is this: greatness isn't born, it's made. The young George Washington wasn't a genius. He wasn't a gifted speaker. He was an ambitious, insecure young man from the provinces, painfully aware of his own shortcomings. But he had something more valuable than natural genius, an unwavering commitment to self-improvement. He was, as one historian perfectly put it, a man constructing himself. He learned from his mistakes. The impulsive young officer who stumbled at Fort Necessity became the patient, calculating general who triumphed at Yorktown. The man who'd been a conventional Virginia slaveholder became, in his final act, an emancipator. He never stopped growing. And that, I believe, is the heart of his secret. His leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about constantly striving to be better. It was about character. He was a man of absolute integrity. In an age of schemes and shifting loyalties, he was the one person everyone could trust. He was given immense power as commander-in-chief, as president, because people knew he wouldn't abuse it. His greatest act wasn't winning the war, but surrendering his sword. Not becoming president, but stepping down. He showed the world that the true measure of a leader isn't how they grab power, but how they let it go. His story also teaches us something profound about freedom's nature. Washington understood that liberty isn't a gift, it's a responsibility. It requires discipline, self-control, and commitment to the common good. He feared that the young republic, drunk on its own freedom, might collapse into chaos. "We are either a united people," he said, "or we are 13 independent sovereignties, eternally counteracting each other." He knew that for liberty to survive, there had to be order, there had to be a nation. So how can you, a young person on the edge of your own life, apply Washington's lessons? First, commit yourself to lifelong learning and self-improvement. Read widely. Study great lives. Identify your own weaknesses and work relentlessly to overcome them. Washington's life proves the power of deliberate practice and relentless self-discipline. Second, build a reputation for absolute integrity. In everything, be honest, be fair, be true to your word. Your character is the most valuable thing you'll ever possess. It's the foundation all real success is built on. Finally, commit yourself to something larger than yourself. Washington dedicated his life to the glorious cause of American liberty. He found his purpose not in personal gain, but in public service. Find your own glorious cause. Whether it's in your community, your country, or the world, find a way to serve others. That's the path to a life of real meaning and significance. That was a summary of Washington: A Life by Ron Chernow. We've touched on the major moments today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only take you so far. The real magic happens when you hold the book in your hands. It's in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This podcast is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you see leadership, character, and nation building. There's a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.